In May of 2025, a woman camping near Millstream in the Pilbara region of Western Australia posted a short video online describing something that had happened at her camp the night before. Two glowing lights had appeared near her campsite after dark. And in her account, she described them the way her own family always had. Not as anything to be afraid of. Not as a threat. As something closer to a visitor passing through. She was not the first person from that part of the country to describe exactly this, and she almost certainly will not be the last. If you've seen our earlier episode on the Min Min light, you already know the broad shape of this mystery. The glowing orb that has followed travellers across Outback Queensland for well over a century, and the atmospheric theory that explains a great deal of it without ever quite explaining all of it. What that episode couldn't tell you is that the exact same kind of light, described in almost identical terms, has kept showing up in a completely different corner of the continent, reported by people with no connection to Boulia, no familiarity with the folklore, and no obvious reason to describe a stranger's century-old ghost story as their own lived experience. This is Ancient Aussie History, where we go looking for the parts of this country most people never find, and the ancient story most of us were never taught in school. Subscribe now, and if you'd rather listen, every episode is also a podcast on Spotify, link below. Because tonight, we're looking at two of this country's strangest unexplained lights. One that keeps quietly reappearing decades after everyone assumed the story was closed, and one that, for a few weeks in the 1960s, turned an entire Queensland town into the most talked about UFO case in Australian history. The light that was never confined to one town. We're not going to retread everything we already covered about Boulia. That story has its own full episode, linked for you if you haven't seen it. What matters tonight is one simple fact. The Min Min phenomenon was never confined to one town. Traditional custodians in the Pilbara, separated from Boulia by well over 2,000 kilometres of desert, have described comparable lights for generations, using an entirely different cultural framework to explain what they were seeing. That distinction matters more than it first appears. A sighting like the one near Millstream is not a copycat story borrowed from Queensland folklore. It is an independent report, from a completely different part of the continent, describing the same basic phenomenon, decades after the scientific community assumed it had already been accounted for. 2,000 kilometres of desert between the witnesses. No shared local legend. No obvious channel by which one story could have seeded the other. And yet the description lands in the same place. A glowing light, appearing after dark, behaving in a way that doesn't fit anything in the ordinary catalogue of what the Outback night is supposed to contain. That alone should tell you something about how unfinished this mystery actually is. And notice how the woman near Millstream framed it. Not as a fright, not as a spook story, but as a visitor. A thing her family had always spoken of in calm, matter-of-fact terms, part of the fabric of that country rather than an intrusion upon it. That is the tell that separates a genuine cultural tradition from a borrowed ghost story. People who inherit a legend secondhand tend to inherit the fear that comes with it. People who inherit real, lived knowledge of their own country tend to describe it the way you'd describe the weather or a familiar animal. Something known, something placed, something that belongs. The Pilbara custodians were not repeating Boulia's story. They were telling their own, and it happened to point at the same thing. But tonight, Boulia is only half the story. Before we go further, one quick thing that ties directly into everything we cover on this channel. I've put together an ebook called The Timeline Lie. 15 documented sites across every Australian state where peer-reviewed archaeology has quietly rewritten the history most of us were taught in school, using evidence that is decades old, fully verified, and still barely known outside academic circles. If mysteries like tonight's interest you, that book goes even deeper into the parts of this country's past that were never properly explained to the public. The link is below the video if you'd like a look. Now, to the second mystery, and one of the strangest single mornings in this country's recorded history. 9 o'clock on the 19th of January, 1966. At around 9 o'clock on the morning of the 19th of January, 1966, a 28-year-old banana farmer named George Pedley was driving a tractor across a property near Tully in far north Queensland. It was the wet season. Humid, overcast, the kind of heavy tropical morning the region is known for. And Pedley was working close to a body of water called Horseshoe Lagoon. As he approached it, he noticed what he took for a misfire in the tractor's engine, then heard a sharp hissing sound he first mistook for a leaking tyre. When he looked up, he watched a large, grey, saucer-shaped object rise directly out of the lagoon, climb to roughly treetop height, tilt slightly to one side, and then accelerate away to the southwest, gone from sight within seconds. Pedley estimated the object at around 25 feet across and roughly 9 feet thick through its centre. The entire encounter, from the first thing he saw to the last, lasted no more than 4 seconds. And that is where a lesser story would end. A single witness, a few seconds, nothing to show for it. But Pedley, shaken, climbed down from the tractor and pushed his way through waist-high reeds to the edge of the lagoon. And there he found the thing that would end up defining this case far more than his own testimony ever could. A large, perfectly circular patch of water, completely stripped of the reeds that covered the rest of the lagoon, the water inside it slowly rotating on its own. The reeds within the circle were not simply flattened or broken. They appeared to have been swept aside and matted down into a thick, compressed layer, strong enough to walk on. Witnesses at the time described it as almost spongy underfoot, yet firm enough to hold a person's weight without sinking. There was no mud disturbed at the base of the circle, no insect life, no algae, nothing you'd normally expect in a tropical lagoon of that kind, and the water inside the circle was unusually clear compared to the murkier water all around it. Nearby, on the branch of a tree several feet away, a patch of leaves had been scorched brown. Sitting directly beside other leaves on the very same branch that was still completely green and healthy. The word that entered the language. Word of the incident spread fast, and within days more circles, smaller ones, were found elsewhere around the same lagoon, despite nobody reporting having seen an object land or take off from those spots. The press seized on it immediately, and the term saucer nest entered popular use for the first time anywhere. A phrase that would go on to describe UFO landing trace cases all over the world for decades afterwards. If you're finding tonight's stories as strange as I am, make sure you're subscribed, because the investigation into what happened at Tully raised almost as many questions as it answered. And what came next is what kept this case alive for years. Investigators from the era's flying saucer research organizations descended on the property within weeks. So did several scientific bodies, looking for a natural explanation that could close the case quickly. And the most obvious candidate was the weather. Tully sits in one of the wettest regions in the entire country, and Pedley's sighting fell squarely within the annual wet season, when localized storms and strong rotating wind systems, the willy-willies familiar to anyone who's worked that country, are common. The proposal was straightforward. A small atmospheric vortex, a miniature localized whirlwind, could, in theory, flatten reeds into a roughly circular pattern as it crossed the lagoon surface. That explanation ran into a specific technical problem almost immediately. Vortex systems in the southern hemisphere rotate in a consistent direction, set by the same atmospheric forces that shape the spin of full-size cyclones. But the direction of the flattened reeds and the pattern of the matted vegetation inside the Tully nests did not consistently match the rotation a genuine willy-willy would be expected to produce. Researchers who examined the case in detail over the following decades, including field investigations conducted as late as 1987 and 1990, concluded that the whirlwind explanation simply did not fit the physical evidence closely enough to be considered settled. Why Tully didn't fade. What separates Tully from a story you could wave away as one excitable witness is what happened over the years that followed. Similar nest formations kept appearing at the same lagoon, periodically well beyond Pedley's original sighting, with notable clusters recorded again in 1968, 1969, 1972, and 1975. Tully rapidly earned a reputation as something close to the UFO capital of Australia. And the researchers who spent years personally interviewing Pedley, the landowner, and the other witnesses connected to the case consistently found no evidence of a hoax, no plausible motive for one, and no physical explanation that fully accounted for the compressed, spongy texture of the flattened vegetation or the scorched leaves found near several of the sites. George Pedley himself never wavered from his account in the years that followed. He reportedly told researchers that he had seen wet whirlwinds and dust whirlwinds plenty of times in his life working the land, and that whatever passed low over that lagoon on the morning of the 19th of January was not one of them. And that's worth weighing carefully, because Pedley was not a tourist or a thrill seeker. He was a man who worked that specific country for a living, in the exact season the whirlwind theory depends on, who knew precisely what a willy-willy looked like moving across wet ground. The most obvious natural explanation was being rejected not by a skeptic in a city office, but by the one person standing there who had the most direct experience of the phenomenon it was supposed to be. The physical anomalies are what keep the file open. A whirlwind can flatten reeds, but it does not, as a rule, mat them into a compressed layer firm enough to stand on, leave the mud beneath completely undisturbed, strip out the insect life and algae, and clear the water inside a sharp circular boundary while the water just outside stays murky. And a whirlwind certainly does not scorch a patch of leaves brown while leaving the leaves right beside them green. Each detail on its own might be argued away. It is the combination. Several anomalies, in one place, at one time, that 6 decades of investigators have not been able to fold neatly back into the weather. What often gets left out of the retellings is just how quickly and how seriously this was treated at the time, rather than being brushed off as a curiosity. Field investigators were on the property within weeks. The Royal Australian Air Force itself logged the report through official channels, alongside the civilian flying saucer research groups then active in Queensland. And later investigations by dedicated researchers returned to Horseshoe Lagoon again and again over the decades, conducting fresh site surveys as late as the early 1990s, still trying to reconcile the physical evidence with a conventional explanation. That level of sustained, methodical attention is rare for almost any unexplained case, let alone one built around a single 4-second sighting by one man. 60 years on, no fully satisfying explanation for the Tully saucer nest has ever been agreed upon. The lagoon still sits quietly on private farmland in far north Queensland, largely unknown outside dedicated research circles, despite being one of the most thoroughly investigated physical trace cases in the country's history. 2 lights, 1 pattern. Put these 2 mysteries side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge that is worth sitting with. A light near Boulia that has been seen, described, and chased for more than a century, still reappearing today in places as far away as the Pilbara, among people with no connection to the original folklore at all. And a single 4-second encounter over a Queensland lagoon that left behind physical evidence still being studied and re-examined by researchers more than half a century later. Neither has ever been fully closed. Neither has ever been fully explained away. And it's worth being honest about what that does and does not mean. It does not mean the answer is little grey men, or spacecraft, or anything from beyond this Earth. The evidence does not carry us there, and it doesn't need to. Mirages are real. Vortices are real. The physics of light bent across hot, flat country, and of wind moving across water, are genuine and well documented, and they account for a real share of what people have reported. But in both of these cases, the leading conventional explanation openly fails to cover part of the record. The light that seems to respond to being approached, the matted vegetation whose spin doesn't match the wind, the scorched leaves beside the living ones. And that gap, the part the tidy answer can't quite reach, is exactly where the mystery has gone on living. What ties it together is the witnesses. Not one excitable traveller, but Aboriginal custodians describing lights their ancestors knew for thousands of years, on opposite sides of a continent, in separate languages. And a banana farmer who logged his report with the Air Force was interviewed for decades and never once changed his story. People with no reason to invent anything, simply telling the truth about something the rest of us have never quite managed to catch up to. Whatever is out there, on that flat outback plain near Boulia, in the still water of a North Queensland lagoon, it does not appear to be finished showing itself just yet. If a story like this changes how you look at the Outback night, leave it in the comments. And subscribe to Ancient Aussie History for more of the strange, ancient, and unresolved corners of this country hiding in plain sight.